what we're going to be doing today is we're going to finish up our look at the factors that can contribute to phobic conditioning, factors that can contribute to any form of conditioning that might lead to mental illness, things that make people rather susceptible. And then we're going to introduce the operant conditioning, which is going to be the next major type of conditioning. So we were camped out on classical conditioning for a while, and now we're going to do the second major type of learning that we all use, which is operant learning or operant conditioning. All right, so introduction. We're going to conclude our look at additional factors in phobic conditioning. Then we're going to introduce operant conditioning. We're going to go talk about the major components of operant conditioning, the behavior, consequences, and antecedents. And then we're going to take a look at the 4 types of contingencies: positive reinforcement, the one that society gets wrong all the time, and it's a pet peeve of mine, negative reinforcement. Positive punishment and negative punishment, we'll take a look at those. And we'll end with a look at shaping, and that'll wrap up today's class. All right, phobic conditioning. So why do some people develop mental disorders, other people don't? Why do people go through the exact same experiences? Some come out on the other side completely unscathed, other people come out completely conditioned. We took a look at some factors already, so we'll finish it up. The next one we were going to look at was incubation. And incubation is another one of these ones where it's kind of sneaky, and it is where, oh no, this is one we've already done, so just to briefly recap, I'll mention this one again. This is where your conditioned fear gets strengthened after brief exposures to the conditioned stimulus. So I included this one again because this is one of the best reasons where if you're trying to get over a mental illness that has a conditioning component to it, like phobias, make sure you're going to a professional, somebody that will know about incubation. Because if you try to do it yourself, you are playing into making the problem worse. And we're going to see this throughout this course. There are times when people with the best of intentions have made problems worse. So if you go to a professional, they will not allow incubation to happen. If you try to fight a spider phobia on your own, and you muster up all the will, and you go down to your basement and you see a spider and you just don't have it that day and you run the other way, you've gone through incubation, you've made your fear worse. If you have social anxiety and you don't like to engage in conversations, you don't like to break the ice or instigate conversations at a party, and you figure this time is the time that I'm going to do it, I'm going to overcome my fears, I'm going to overcome my social anxiety, and you go up to talk to somebody, and as soon as you say hi, just the anxiety comes back and you flee to a safe space, you've made it worse. You've contributed to the problem. So be aware that that's another factor in phobic conditioning, that incubation, those brief exposures to what you fear. All right, so the new ones. I believe we got 2 more. First one, US revaluation. So what US revaluation is when you're exposed to an unconditioned stimulus of different intensity than the one that was used during conditioning, then the strength of your conditioned stimulus will increase. So what this is if you, in the classical conditioning paradigm, you have your conditioned stimulus followed by an unconditioned stimulus, and that leads to the unconditioned response. So people in action sports, oftentimes have this contingency in place when they fall, when they get injured. So if you're somebody who does skateboarding, snowboarding, you'll know that you have that conditioned stimulus of strapping into your board. You have that unconditioned stimulus of pain when you catch an edge and you fall down. And that leads to the unconditioned response of fear. Nobody likes pain. Pain will lead to fear. So there's always that little bit of fear. That's where the adrenaline rush comes from, right? There's always that little bit when you're looking down the slope and you're thinking to yourself, this seems like a bad idea. But then you go and it's fun and it's not too much. It's not too much of an unconditioned stimulus. If you fall down, it hurts, but it's not too much. So your conditioned stimulus, looking down that slope, causes the conditioned response of fear, but that's enough to make it exciting. That's enough to make it interesting. If you are then exposed to an unconditioned stimulus that is massive amounts of pain, so let's say you get into a car accident and you are in the hospital for weeks and you are on painkillers, and that unconditioned stimulus of pain has been jacked up to 1,000. That car crash has nothing to do with snowboarding, but through US unconditioned stimulus revaluation, now that huge amount of unconditioned stimulus of pain, which leads to a huge amount of unconditioned response, which is fear, will now get associated to the conditioned stimulus of that slope. So you might have never been injured really badly snowboarding. You might have loved snowboarding before, but after that car crash, the next time you get on that slope and you look down, massive amounts of conditioned responses of fear might come to the point where you're like, I can't do this, and you take that walk down the back of the mountain. So that's US revaluation. And then the last one, I believe, and this is one of the ones where it's just your mind piling on in a very unfair way, but it's our minds, what they do. Selective sensitization. And this is your increased sensitivity and your increased reactivity to stimuli after exposure to unrelated stressful events. So if you have been exposed to unrelated stressful events, you are actually more sensitive to conditioning. You're actually more sensitive to develop mental illnesses. You're actually more sensitive to develop a phobia than if everything was going fine and you didn't have stressful events. So this is, again, something that your mind is just, you wish it was the other way. So if you went to work and it's a stressful job and you just got chewed out by your boss and now your job is on the line and you're driving home and you're not paying attention and you go through a stoplight and you get pulled over and now you got a fine and you get points off your license and your insurance is going to go up, and then you come home and you trip on the stairs going up to your door and now you scraped your knee, and it's just stress upon stress upon stress upon stress, and then you see the spider, chances are you're going to be developing a phobia. Your chances of developing that fear to the spider are increased. So it's not like your mind gives you a break. It's not like your mind says, hey, you're having a bad day. How about I don't develop any mental illnesses, give you a break. No, you're having a bad day. It makes you more susceptible through this process of selective sensitization. All right, so any final questions on the factors of phobic conditioning? All right, let's get to operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is the conditioning of behaviors. So, everything was a conditioning of behaviors. Let me restate that. Operant conditioning is the conditioning of performed behaviors. Classical conditioning was the conditioning of responses. So operant conditioning is the conditioning that is done when you take a beginner, somebody trying to learn to play the piano, and you change them through learning into somebody that is an expert at playing the piano. So operant conditioning is where new complex behaviors come from. So anything that we can do that is extremely complex is the result of operational learning. So operational conditioning, we're going to say goodbye Pavlov's dog. He'll be back, but not for a while. We're going to say hello to Skinner's rat instead. And we're going to take a look at an example of operational learning. We're going to take a look at the end result. And this is, we're going back to the Westminster Dog Show. And we're going to take a look at operational learning, its effects in action.
Got the turn there. This is a little quick burst of speed right here. Howard gets in front of Pink. Makes a nice line right there. Trying to get all they can.
I think people are surprised by how quick and athletic the Papillons are.
You know, you think about the
I know I'm surprised by how quick and athletic the Papillons are.
I'll tell you, these small dogs, they're athletes. And look at this dog go. You go, Pink.
Trying to beat 39.65.
Contact.
He was shattered.
Oh gosh. Shatters the record. All right, so all of that operational learning, right? You can't get there with classical conditioning. You can make that dog salivate as much as you want to a bell. It's never going to run that course with classical conditioning. It's operant conditioning that is going to get those complex behaviors and be able to chain those complex behaviors together. So the link is there if you want to watch the highlights from the 2008 Westminster Dog Show. But away we go for operant conditioning. So operant conditioning is very specifically the form of learning where the future probability of a behavior is affected by its consequences. And that affected by its consequences is the big, one of the big differences. So it's still learning, it's still a change in behavior over time due to experiences, and it changes the future probability of a behavior. So that's kind of like classical conditioning, right? Classical conditioning changes the future probability that a dog would salivate when he hears the bell. So far it's kind of like classical conditioning. But here's the big difference. It's affected by the consequences. This time, the behavior is followed by consequences. So in classical conditioning, the dog received food whether or not it salivated to the bell. In classical conditioning, the rat was shocked whether or not it started to jump or freeze. But here is the first time where consequences come in. So if you do the behavior, something happens. If you don't do the behavior, something else happens. That's the key to operant, or the key difference to operant conditioning. So we're going to break this down much like we did with classical conditioning. Operant conditioning has certain terms that we need to be aware of. So the first one, operant behavior. This is the class of emitted responses that result in certain consequences. So this is basically the class of behavior that leads to certain outcomes. So the classic operant behavior is the bar press. So here we have the rat in the Skinner box, and the rat is being trained to press that bar. It's called a class of emitted responses because it doesn't have to press the bar in a specific way. It can press it with its front paws, it could press it with its snout, it could press it with its butt if it wanted to. As long as the bar is pressed, there's going to be an outcome. So that's why they have that class of emitted responses. It's all the responses that are going to lead to those consequences. And then we have components, and we have the consequences, and those, through learning, affect the probability of these responses. So these responses, these operant behaviors, their probability is either going to go up, they're going to become more likely to occur, or their probability is going to go down, they're going to become less likely to occur, and that all depends on the consequences. So this operant behavior, they're also called operant responses, they're also called operants. So we're going to stick to operant behavior as much as we can, but just so that you know, if you continue on in the psychology of learning, different people call it different things. You might see operant responses or operants. It's all the same thing, it's that operant behavior. All right, so what we have here is we have a contingency. So if a lever press occurs, that will cause food to be delivered. So notice once again we have that same sort of, we're taking some notation from classical conditioning. So if you remember, the arrow means causes. So the lever press causes food to be delivered. In this case, the lever press is the operant behavior, and the food is the consequence. So we have a behavior now followed by a consequence. If we have an operant behavior, that is the lever press, but now that lever press is followed by shock, once again we have the operant behavior of the lever press, and we have the shock, which is the consequence. You can probably figure out one of these is going to make the lever press more likely to occur in the future. One of those is going to make the lever press less likely to occur in the future. So the probability of the operant response will go up or it will go down based on those consequences. All right, so yeah, I kind of jumped the gun on myself there. So if the lever press is followed by certain consequences, the future probability of that lever press will increase. So no surprise, if you give a rat food after they press a lever, they will press that lever more frequently, more often in the future. On the other hand, if you shock a rat for pressing a bar, if you shock them in the right way, the future probability of that lever press will decrease. So once again, what happens to the operant behavior depends upon the consequences that occur after the behavior is done. All right, so we have that idea of behaviors, now we have the idea of consequences. The consequences are either going to cause the behavior to increase in probability in the future or to decrease in probability of the future, and that is where we get the labels for what the consequence is. So a consequence is a reinforcer if that consequence increases future probability. This is very important to understand. A reinforcer is not something that the organism necessarily likes. It's not something that we think is good for the organism. It's not something that we think will help the organism. It's not something that we think is good, good or beneficial. It is just something that will increase the future probability of a behavior. If you have a behavior and you follow it with a reinforcer, the probability of that behavior will go up. That is the only definition for a reinforcer. The other type of consequence is a punisher. And a punisher is a consequence that decreases the probability of that operant behavior in the future, and that is it. So it's not something that the organism doesn't like. It's not something that we think is bad for the organism. It's not something that we as humans might think will be punishment for the organism. It's whether or not the behavior goes down as a result of that consequence. If it does, then that consequence is a punisher. So if the lever press is followed by food, so the operant behavior is followed by the operant consequences, and the future probability of lever presses increases, we then know that food is a reinforcer. And that's how we know that food is a reinforcer, because the presentation of food will increase the probability of that bar being pressed. If the lever press is followed by a shock, and the probability of the lever presses decrease, then we know that the shock is a punisher. And as I mentioned, if you shock in the correct way, the shock will be a punisher because the lever press will go down in probability. So for example, if you shock the floor, then the shock will be a punisher because the rat will stop pressing the bar. On the other hand, if you set up electrodes in that rat's brain, and this study has been done, and you send a shock to the pleasure center of their brain, that lever press will shoot through the roof in terms of its frequency. That would indicate that the shock is a reinforcer. So be very careful before somebody asks, is a shock a punisher or, is a piece of pie a reinforcer? You only know after the fact If it makes the probability of the behavior go up, reinforcer. If it makes the probability of the behavior go down, it's a punisher. So we got food being a reinforcer. So we would write that, the terms for that, we have up here. So we have the operant behavior, or operant response, that's why we got the R there. We got the operant behavior of the lever press. We have food as the stimulus, but we got that little R. That means that food is a reinforcer. So food as a reinforcer would be written as S with the superscript R. So read that as reinforcer. As always, we don't want to, SR means nothing. Reinforcer means a lot more. So that's food as a reinforcer. In this case, shock makes the probability of the lever press go down. Shock is a punisher. And we write that with the superscript P. So we have the stimulus with a P here for punisher. So once again, read that as punisher. The operant behavior leads to the punisher. That would lead to a decrease in that operant behavior. So far, so good? All right, we got one more component to our diagrams here, and that's operant antecedents. So these are stimuli that signal the consequences of behavior. So these are the stimuli that tell us what certain behavior is going to lead to certain consequences. These are the ones that tell us what rules are in place in any particular situation. So, for example, you could set up a Skinner box so that when a tone is played, if during that time the rat presses the lever, food will be delivered. In that case, the tone is an operant antecedent, and it's still a stimulus, but it's got this SD over there. So that's an operant antecedent. Specifically, this is a discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. But this tone, followed by a lever press, will cause food. So in layman's terms, this tone is what tells the rat, if I press the lever now, I'm going to get food. That's an operant antecedent. So if your operant antecedent indicates reinforcement, technically it's called a discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. But because this is the most often studied operant antecedent, they shorten it to just discriminative stimulus. So be careful with that. All operant antecedents are discriminative stimuli, but for what? Discriminative stimulus for reinforcement means that when this condition, when this stimulus is present, you do the operant response, you're going to receive a reinforcement. All right, so we might have another tone that is being played, and for this tone, if the rat presses the lever, now the lever press will lead to a shock. So in this case, we have a discriminative stimulus once more. So that's that super something font there with the D. But now it's a DP, so the discriminative stimulus for punishment. So that's the indication that the operant behavior is now going to be followed by a punisher, is a discriminative stimulus for punishment. So in our everyday lives, we have many of these operant antecedents. So if you ever change your behavior in different settings, that means that you have operant antecedents that indicate certain contingencies. So when you were growing up, you might have been, your friends might have thought, I'm trying to say this without sounding like I'm 80 years old. Your friends might have thought that swear words were really cool, right? So your friends might have thought that, you know, dropping F-bombs and you know, using B words and S words or whatever, that was just really cool. And when your friends were around and you dropped those F-bombs, you got reinforced for it, right? So your friends would be a discriminative stimulus for reinforcement, where that behavior of foul language led to reinforcement of social connections and social status and all that kind of stuff. They were an operant, they were a discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. When your parents walked into the room and they didn't want you learning that language, they were a discriminative stimulus for punishment. And you knew that if you use that type of language, your parents would be like, all right, you know, you're grounded, no more privileges, I don't want you using that language. They would punish that to make the probability go down. So again, if you ever have changed your behavior in two different situations, like we all do, you're under the control of operant antecedents, indicating that this behavior will be punished in this situation, this behavior will be rewarded in this other situation. Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, what did you say that your friends would be in that situation? What would you label that?
Your friends would actually be the source of reinforcement in that situation. So they would do actions, they would do behaviors that would serve as reinforcers for you. So, you know, again, I'm trying to, pats on the back, you know, smiles, laughing at your, you know, what you just said. Those would all be forms of reinforcement that would make you more likely to use that language in the future. Your parents would be the source of punishment. So if they grounded you, took away dessert, took away your tablet, no more, you know, changed Wi-Fi password on you, those are all behaviors that would lead to a decrease. Those would all be punishments. And there was another question? Yep.
I think that kind of answered it. I just want to for clarification. So basically, a discriminative stimulus is like the presence of a stimulus that predicts punishment, almost, or?
It's the presence of a stimulus that predicts what contingency is in operation. So it could be predicting punishment, in which case it's a discriminative stimulus for punishment. It could be predicting reinforcement, in which case it's a discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. So a very clear-cut example, and one that I probably should have started with, driving through an intersection, right? That's an operant behavior, right? If you have your license, you've learned how to drive through an intersection. And we have also learned that the stoplight is your discriminative stimulus for different contingencies. So if you drive through the intersection when it's a green light, that's your discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. You're going to get to where you're going. If you do the same behavior, drive through that intersection during a red light, that's your discriminative stimulus for punishment. You might get pulled over by the police, you might get into an accident, and that makes the probability of that decrease. Now let's take a look at another behavior in driving. Staying stopped, staying still, right? When you're staying still and it's a red light, that's your discriminative stimulus for reinforcement. It keeps you safe, you know, nobody's yelling at you, right? If you're standing still at an intersection during a green light, that's your discriminative stimulus for punishment. People are going to start yelling at you, they're going to drive by you, they're going to flip you off, they're going to honk their horns. So the same, same behavior can lead to a punishment or a reinforcement depending upon when it happens. And indications of which one is which are those discriminative stimuli. So they can be for either punishment or reinforcement. And actually, there's one more, and this is the third possibility, and that is when something is occurring, your behavior might lead to nothing. So there are discriminative stimuli where the behavior actually does nothing. It doesn't do anything that leads to reinforcement. It doesn't do anything that leads to punishment. It literally just does absolutely nothing. And this is your discriminative stimulus for extinction. It just tells you that nothing is going to happen in this particular case. So that's all three possibilities. Either something's going to happen that increases the probability of your behavior, that's a reinforcer, or something's going to happen that decreases the probability, that's a punisher, or something's going to happen that does neither, and that's this discriminative stimulus for extinction. All right, so those are the basic kind of parts of operant conditioning. Any questions on that before we start delving into a little bit more? All right, so operant conditioning is, again, the learning that allows you to learn very complicated behaviors. Operant conditioning is a learning that allows you to go from a novice, a beginner playing the piano, to being able to play massive very complicated pieces of music. And operant learning is based on, again, these what are called contingencies. And it's basically the result of a behavior. Will it lead to a reinforcer or will it lead to a punisher? And you've probably encountered the ideas of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, maybe not so much positive punishment and negative punishment, but those are the four major contingencies that we're going to look at. And I just want to draw your attention to the reinforcer ones, because those are the ones that people often get wrong. So if you're teaching this child to get to that proficiency, or if you're a parent and you're trying to raise your children to have good behaviors, in discussions with other people, you'll often hear them say things like, well, we really believe in positive reinforcement. We want to help our child develop in a very positive manner. So we really believe in positive reinforcement. We don't believe in negative reinforcement. Like, we never spank our kids. Ooh, negative reinforcement. That's not negative reinforcement. It's not. So you've probably, prior to coming to this class, been conditioned in terms of what negative reinforcement is. Throw it all out the window, because society has gotten negative reinforcement completely wrong. What they're talking about is positive punishment. So this is one of the pet peeves of mine. You'll see it pop up over and over and over again. So this is a sort of little exercise you can do when you're watching, your TV shows, movies, or when you're listening to interviews of famous people. Next time somebody mentions negative reinforcement, ask yourself, did they get it wrong? Did they mean something else? And one of the examples, it's in one of my favorite movies, and it pains me. It's from Ghostbusters, and this shows you the importance of a quality education, because Dr. Venkman, if you're not familiar with Ghostbusters, Dr. Venkman, Bill Murray's character, has a PhD in psychology and parapsychology, but apparently the institution he was granted that PhD from was not very good, because he does not know what negative reinforcement is. So let's take a look at him getting it completely wrong.
Great. You tell me what you think it is.
Also, the ethical violations in this are astounding. You'd be called into so many departments in his, anyways, enjoy.
Square. Good guess, but wrong. Clear. All right. Tell me what you think.
Is it a star?
It is a star. Very good. That's great. Okay. All right. Think hard. What is it? Circle. Close. Spot definite. Wrong. Okay. All right. Ready? What is it?
Figure eight.
Incredible. It's 5 for 5. You can't see these, can you?
No.
You're not cheating me, right?
No, I swear they're just coming to me.
Okay. Nervous?
Yes. I don't like this.
You only have 75 more to go. Okay? What's this one?
Just a couple of wavy lines.
Sorry. This isn't your lucky day.
No. Wait, excuse me. Get a little tired of this.
You volunteered, didn't you? We're paying you, aren't we?
Yeah, but I didn't know you were going to be giving me electric shocks. What are you trying to prove here anyway?
I'm studying the effect of negative reinforcement on ESP ability.
Fat predator?
All right, so many ethical violations there, and a just knowledge violation is not negative reinforcement. So we're going to see exactly what it was, but that is not negative reinforcement. It's what people think is negative reinforcement, but the shocking for the incorrect answers is something completely different. So let's take a look at what this actually is. And we will do that by taking a look at the 4 types of contingencies. So again, we have positive reinforcement, which society usually gets right. Negative reinforcement, which they always get wrong. Positive punishment and negative punishment, which they don't actually really discuss very much at all. So the way to think about these is that they're made up of 2 components. Each of these contingencies is made up of 2 separate pieces. One, whether it's positive or negative, and then 2, whether it's reinforcement or punishment. So these are the contingencies that can follow any behavior. So remember, these are the consequences of a behavior. So if you want to change the probability of a behavior, you apply one of these 4 consequences to that behavior. So what do they entail? Well, if you follow a behavior by presenting something to the individual that did the behavior, that is a positive contingency. So if the consequence of a behavior is that you give something to the person doing the behavior, you introduce something to the environment of the person doing the behavior. Basically, you add something to their environment. That's where the positive part comes from. It's like a plus sign. You add something to their environment, that is a positive contingency. Now, if the addition of that thing that you did, if the addition of that consequence leads to that behavior increasing, they're more likely in the future to perform that behavior, well, then you have positive, where you presented something, behavior increases, that is reinforcement, so therefore we have positive reinforcement. So positive reinforcement, the behavior occurs, you give something to the individual, that behavior goes up in probability, that's a positive reinforcement contingency. Let's say that we have another contingency. A different behavior occurs. We still present something to the individual. We still introduce something, add something to their environment, but this time the behavior actually decreases. If that's the consequence of adding something, we added something so it's a positive consequence, however the behavior decreased, that makes it punishment, that is positive punishment. So those are the 2 positive contingencies. You add something to the environment and the behavior goes up, positive reinforcement. You add something to the environment, behavior goes down, positive punishment. So again, positive has nothing to do with whether or not it's good, whether or not it's ethical, whether or not it's socially acceptable. Positive is simply, did you add something to the situation? If you did, that's a positive contingency. The other contingency is the other 2 contingencies are negative. So let's say that a behavior occurs, and as a consequence of that behavior, you take something away from the individual. You take something away from their environment. You take something away from their current situation. That's negative. You have subtracted something, right? That's where the negative comes from. If that takeaway leads to the behavior increasing, so the consequence of the behavior was that something was taken away. If that takeaway leads to that behavior increasing, then that is negative reinforcement. Once again, negative meaning takeaway, not bad, not socially unacceptable, not even harmful. That's negative reinforcement. So to round out the 4th contingency, if a behavior occurs and then you take something away, that's negative. If that leads to a decrease in behavior, That behavior decrease is punishment. So take something away, leads to behavior decrease, that is negative punishment. So all four of these contingencies will change behavior, right? The reinforcement ones make behavior go up, the punishment ones make behavior go down. The positive ones is the addition of something to the individual or the environment. The negative ones are the taking away of something from the individual or the environment. So let's see these four in action if you were training this child to play the piano. All right, so we'll start off with the contingency that she's under. So we have the operational antecedent, which is practice time. We have the operant behavior that we want to increase the probability of. That is the correct scale. And let's say that we're using praise as a reinforcer. So practice time is the indication that she's going to get, she has this contingency in place. So it's after school, it's 4:30, she knows that that's practice time. So if she plays the correct scale, she's going to get reinforced. Contrast this with 3 a.m. in the morning, where if she plays the correct scale, her parents are going to yell at her and say, go to bed. You're not allowed outside of your bed. So once again, that operant antecedent sets the stage. So she plays the correct scale, dun 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 dun. And after she does that behavior, you as a teacher, you say, oh, good job. Way to go. You did great. That was so good. You are adding something to the environment. You are adding praise. You're adding verbal behavior to her environment. So she plays her scale. That's the behavior. As a consequence of that scale, you add something to the environment. You add this verbal praise. Good girl, way to go. You've really been practicing. I'm really proud of you. That's the addition of something to the environment. That is going to lead that behavior to increase. She is more likely to play that correct scale in the future. That is an example of positive reinforcement. So this is the one, again, that society gets right. If somebody saw this situation occurring, they would take a look at it and say, oh, I like this teacher. They use a lot of positive reinforcement. And they would be right. That's exactly what positive reinforcement is. All right, any questions on positive reinforcement? All right, let's take a look at the next contingency. So we, once again, have practice time. But this time we have the incorrect scale. And an incorrect scale is something that we want to decrease the probability of, right? The dun 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 bing, right? We don't want that. We want to decrease the probability that that is going to occur. So let's say that we follow it up with scorn, right? So dun 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 bang. And you're like, oh my gosh, that was horrible. You're horrible. You'll never make it as a piano player. You know, it's yeah. So you give scorn. You introduce something to the environment. You introduce basically massive amounts of criticism. All right, in this case, we have the behavior, the incorrect scale. Notice that this is a positive contingency. Why is it positive? Because we added something to the environment. We added something to this individual. We added scorn. We added insults. We added derision. We added criticism. Importantly, we added something. That something is going to cause the probability of that incorrect scale to decrease. So the behavior's probability is going to decrease. She's now going to be less likely to play that incorrect scale in the future. So we have the addition of something, behavior decreases, that's positive punishment. This is what most people get wrong when they're talking negative reinforcement. So if anybody outside of a psychology, without a psychology education saw that, they would say things like, well, I don't think that teacher's doing a very good job. They're using way too much negative reinforcement. That child's not going to respond very well to that, and they would be right, except for the fact that it's not negative reinforcement. So that is positive punishment. So it really, people can't sort of wrap their minds around it because the behavior as a whole is something that society would say, well, that's a bad thing to do. But negative does not mean bad or good. Negative means taking something away. Positive does not mean bad or good. Positive means introducing something. You introduce insults, the behavior decreases, that is positive punishment. All right, so let's take a look at some of the negative contingencies. So once again, it's practice time. Once again, we have the correct scale. We want the correct scale to increase. And let's say that the parents are there during practice time and they hear the correct scale, dun 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 dun, and they go, oh my goodness, sweetie, that was so good. You know what? No broccoli for you tonight. You do not have to finish your broccoli. So in this case, we have a behavior. As a consequence of that behavior, something was taken away, right? In this case, the broccoli was taken away. They said to her, look, in your situation, in your environment, you eat broccoli. But as a consequence of your behavior, we're taking that broccoli away. You don't have to eat that broccoli anymore. Negative, something taken away, that leads to a behavior increase. She's more likely to play that correct scale in the future. That is negative reinforcement. So there is nothing wrong with negative reinforcement. There's nothing socially unacceptable about negative reinforcement. Nobody would take a look at this situation and say to themselves, ooh, I don't agree with those parents. That is negative reinforcement. We don't believe in negative reinforcement. No, you do. You're just calling it the wrong thing. So that's negative reinforcement. Something's taken away, behavior goes up, negative reinforcement. All right, we got one last one. Once again, this is now, to finish it up, this is the punishment one, so it's practice time. The behavior is the incorrect scale. We want that to go down. We want the probability of that to decrease. So let's say that the parents, once again, are in practice time, and they hear the child, and the child's like, dun, 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 blank, right? And the parents go, oh my goodness, you know what? No dessert for you tonight. You played that scale wrong. No dessert. We're taking dessert away. In that case, I know it's extreme. This child's not gonna end up having any dinner by the time she's done practicing. But anyways, to illustrate this point, the behavior now, once again, is being followed by something being taken away. So dessert was a part of this girl's life. Dessert was a part of this girl's environment. Dessert was a part of her situation. Now that dessert got subtracted, negative, taken away from her situation, that's going to lead to a decrease in this behavior of playing the incorrect scale. That is negative punishment. So those are the 4 contingencies that are the major contingencies in operant conditioning. So, given that analysis, what was Dr. Bankman doing? What was Dr. Bankman's contingency if the behavior was incorrect predictions? So first off, notice that there was a discriminative stimulus being inside the experimental room. A discriminative stimulus for extinction was the fact that if you got a correct answer, nothing really happened, right? There was no shock or anything that happened. So he was actually extinguishing or going through extinction for psychic powers. So really, I mean, it was just a horrible experiment from the get-go. But what is this contingency here? So incorrect prediction, as we saw, followed by shock. What was that contingency? That is which? So how many think it's negative punishment? How many think it's positive punishment? Anybody for reinforcement of any kind? Good. All right, so it's definitely not negative reinforcement. So let's take a look at what it actually is. So the behavior is the incorrect prediction. That behavior is followed by the presentation of something, the presentation of shock. Right? So shock is introduced into this person's universe. He goes from somebody that is not being shocked to somebody who is being shocked. Shock is being added. So that's a positive, that's a presentation of something. That leads to a behavior decrease, or hopefully a behavior decrease, and that is positive punishment. So in this case, the contingency that was in place was positive punishment, leads to a decrease in psychic abilities, leads to a decrease in these incorrect predictions. That's what makes this positive punishment. All right, any questions on that? Yep.
Are there any contingencies that have been proven most effective? Or
Yes.
is it situational?
Yes. It's very, it is situational. But the general answer is yes. So both reinforcement contingencies have been found to be effective. So positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, those are both good ways to increase the probability of a behavior occurring in the future. Positive punishment has been shown to have massive problems. So it is effective in terms of changing a behavior, but it brings with it tons of baggage that you have to be aware of. So sometimes you want to use positive punishment, especially in extreme cases of behavior where you have to bring it down. But you have to be aware that it brings with it tons of issues. So one of the big issues is that you will avoid the discriminative stimulus, which is usually, in terms of parenting, for example, the parent. In terms of work, it's the boss, right? So if you have a parent or a boss that does a lot of positive punishment, for example, like if a parent spanks a lot, spanking is positive punishment because after a behavior, you are introducing pain to somebody's rear end. That is positive. It leads to a decrease in the behavior. That is punishment. If you're at work and your boss loads you up with criticism every time they see you, that's positive punishment, right? You did a bad job, you don't have the skills we need, you're worthless, you gotta start pulling your weight, blah, blah, blah. That's the presentation of something that's gonna lead the mistakes that you made to decrease. Both of those are gonna lead people to avoid the person that is giving the contingencies. So both of those are gonna make you either avoid your boss, you see your boss around the corner, you're like, I'm gonna go the other way. They're gonna make you avoid your parents, you see your parents, you're like, well, I don't wanna get in trouble, I'm gonna go the other way. And what that does is it leads to the problem of decreasing the learning. Because if you don't interact with the person enforcing the contingency, you don't have any chance to learn. On the other hand, reinforcement doesn't come with those problems. Because if your parents, for example, are telling you, look, every time you clean your room, I'm gonna give you some M&Ms, right? So every time you clean up your room, maybe not so much, every time you make your bed, I'm gonna give you some M&Ms, right? And you make your bed, and they're like, oh, here's some M&Ms. You're like, yay, I'm gonna make my bed more often in the future. You are not gonna avoid them when you make your bed. You're gonna actively seek them out. So as soon as you make your bed, you're gonna be like, Mom, Dad, come over here, check it out. I made my bed, right? But that's great because that allows you to go through the conditioning, that allows the learning to occur. So positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement has that as well. So you can say things like, oh, I made my bed. No broccoli tonight? And they're like, yeah, no broccoli tonight. Yay, right? So both of those lead to extra conditioning. Positive punishment shuts down a lot of learning. And because of that, you've seen a shift in our culture from positive punishment to negative punishment. So you do have to punish individuals. There are some behaviors that you need to decrease. But whereas children used to get spanked, now they get timeout. And timeout is negative punishment because what happens in timeout is you have all of this stuff that you can do. You have your toys over there, you have the TV over there, you got your tablet over there, you have all these forms of entertainment around you. You do something inappropriate, you sit in a corner. I take all of it away. All of it away means negative. That inappropriate behavior is likely to go down. That's punishment. So negative punishment has become far more popular because of all the research that was done on positive punishment. We'll actually spend an entire class on more of these kind of issues with positive punishment, but that's the answer that yes, it is. Some of these are way better than others. Not because they're less effective in terms of that single trial, but especially positive punishment just brings baggage of problems with it.
So is it fair to say that they will avoid the discriminative stimulus, but they'll also avoid like the punisher that you use? So for example, I make my dog get in his bed when he's bad and he peed in his bed. So is that why he's peeing in his bed? Because the stimulus is conditioned now? Because his bed is something that he associates with a punishment?
It could be. It could be. In that case, you're punishing him by putting him in the bed. The bed as punishment, that would be a negative punishment because you've basically taken away the room that he's allowed to play in and said you are now in basically timeout in this bed. So that would be negative punishment. The fact that he's peeing in the bed, unless there's a consequence to that behavior, that falls into classical conditioning. So it could be that because the punishment can be thought of as an unconditioned stimulus, that leads to the unconditioned response of sadness, of frustration, of whatever the dog might be feeling. It could be now that because you paired that with the bed gets paired with the punishment, so now the bed itself has changed from a neutral stimulus to a conditioned stimulus, which causes the conditioned response of, in this case, urinating in the bed. So if it was going to be an operant conditioning aspect of it, you would have to have a consequence for peeing in the bed, and that would change it into an operant conditioning type thing. And we're going to see more of this where when you take a look at your daily life and the lives of those people around you, you will see contingencies and learning stacked up upon each other. So it's nice sometimes when you get a very clear, example, and that's what we call it the textbook example, because it's clearly just this one kind of thing. But in real life, it's learning stacked upon learning upon learning. So it's a little difficult sometimes to zero in on it without kind of pulling apart, like, here are the 20 things that might be going on. Any other questions? All right, cool. So the last thing we're going to look at today is shaping. And shaping is a absolutely real-world necessity for operant conditioning. And what shaping is it is the gradual creation of these new operant behaviors through successive approximation to that behavior. So successive building upon approximations to the goal behavior, the final behavior that you want to get. So this is, a lot of this will kind of make intuitive sense. So if you were to try to train this child who's never played the piano before to play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, right? Dun 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 dun, right? So if you want to train that child to do that, you could, as your final behavior, have the correct playing of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. And you could put in a contingency where you say, if you play Beethoven's Fifth Symphony correct, I'm going to reinforce you with praise. And you would just sit there with this child at the piano, and you would just say, hit the keys. And the child would be like, bling, bling, bling. And you'd be like, no reinforcement. Let's say that it's only positive reinforcement that's being used. Child, blink, blink, blink. You're like, bing, bong, ting. And you go on, and you go on, and you go on, and you go on. Eventually, this child will go, dun, 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 dun. In which case, you can say, oh my gosh, that was so good. That was amazing. You did so good. And the probability of dun, 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 dun will increase in the future. Unfortunately, the reality of this is that it's going to take you more than 1 billion years before she just randomly hits those notes in that order. And if that was the way that we did operant conditioning, it would be useless because it would just take way too long. It would literally be that, that thought experiment about 1 million monkeys writing on 1 million typewriters, and eventually they'll produce all of Shakespeare's works. Yeah, eventually they will. In multiple billions of years, somebody will come out and produce that work. So if we don't want to wait billions of years, what do? Well, we do shaping. And shaping is that gradual approximation towards that final goal. So this is where she starts, first day of practice. That's where we want to get her to, concert skills playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. When you start her off, you start off with what she can do, right? So right at the beginning, there will be behaviors that she can do. So you can say things like, all right, put your hands here, and let's play this scale. Let's play dun, dun, dun. And she will play things that are like dum, bam, bum, right, in this direction. wrong direction. She will play things, ding dong ding, in this direction, wrong direction. She will eventually play bum bum bum, which is exactly what you want. What you do is you recognize as a, in this case, educator, that this behavior is getting her closer to dun 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 dun. So you reinforce this behavior, you punish or do not reinforce these behaviors, and eventually this behavior is going to become very likely. These behaviors are going to become very unlikely, and you will then have a child who every single time they sit down and you say, can you play those 3 notes? She'll be like dun dun dun, and she'll get it right 100% of the time. From that behavior, you have even more complicated behaviors. And you're going to say things like, well, let's try to play a chord, right? Let's play all of those notes at once. And she will get that behavior sometimes wrong. Sometimes she'll get it right. Right? When she gets it right, you reinforce that behavior, makes that chord more likely. When she gets it wrong, you either punish or do not reinforce that other behavior, makes the other behaviors less likely, and eventually that chord will become so highly likely that it's like 100% of the time, and the other ones will fall to 0% of the time. And you keep doing this. You keep getting more complicated behaviors all the time, choosing behaviors where she is capable and there's a high likelihood that she can produce the correct behavior. So you never want to jump it too far, right? You never want to go beyond what she can currently do. But the key here is that she's going to be able to currently do that behavior, but she's also going to have a high probability of doing incorrect behaviors. And through this idea of successive approximations, successively getting closer and closer, you continually reinforce things until you get to this point where you're like, all right, play the first few bars of Beethoven's Fifth, and she's like, dun 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 blam, and you're like, no, 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 that, wrong way, not that one, try it again, dun 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 dun, and you're like, yes, that's the one, and that's going to make that part way more likely in terms of probability. These are going to decrease, and you've gotten from novice piano player to concert level piano player without waiting around a billion years for that behavior to occur. So shaping is what everybody goes through when they learn these complex behaviors. Shaping is why in kindergarten you learn the alphabet, and then in grade 1 you start to learn how to spell, and then in grade 2, and it just keeps getting more complicated and more complicated. Shaping is why in elementary school you learn addition first, then you learn multiplication, then you learn exponents, because you are able to do addition, and then once addition is wrapped up tight, you are able to do multiplication, and then when multiplication is wrapped up tight, you can do exponents, and then when exponents are wrapped up tight, you can keep going. So shaping is how we get to all that complex behavior. So just one last mention for the dog that was running through the course. The dog's trainer could have waited a billion years until that dog ran through that course. It eventually would have happened, but it would have taken massive amounts of time. On the other hand, what the trainer probably did was just wait until the dog did something that it could do, like walk up one of the ramps, at which point, lots of praise, here's a sausage, here's the clicker, we'll talk about the clicker later, and that led to that behavior. All right, any final questions before we wrap up on today's class?